They thought Maplewick's quiet florist would fold like a pressed flower. But Ruth Delaney had buried too many roots for that. When racist officers came not with handcuffs but with thinly veiled threats disguised as protection, she didn't flinch. She refused. By sundown, her shop was vandalized. By morning, they were dragging her away in cuffs. What they didn't know was who she had raised and how deep justice can grow when planted in silence. This isn't just a story about flowers. It's about power. And they picked the wrong woman. She'd spent a lifetime growing things that survived in silence. But today, someone wanted her silence to wilt. The bell above the shop door didn't chime. It sighed. Ruth Delaney moved through the dim interior of petals and roots like someone easing into an old hymn. Her hands, wrapped in thin gloves, adjusted the latch near the bottom of the front window, which always caught in the cold. She didn't rush. She never rushed. Outside, Maplewick hadn't woken yet. It was the kind of morning that whispered through dry branches and left a faint sting in the air. A cluster of red maple leaves clung stubbornly to the curb. Ruth swept them gently aside with her boot and unlocked the front door. The small shop still smelled like jasmine and damp clay, even in the chill. She turned on the light behind the register, revealing a worn wooden counter and 3 neatly trimmed bonsai in various stages of growth. The plants weren't decorative. They were witnesses. She whispered a soft good morning to them, the way some folks address portraits of their dead. Across the street, inside Grady's cafe, Miriam Lee sipped burnt coffee from a paper cup. She watched Ruth move behind the window like a figure in a snow globe, untouched by noise. Miriam wasn't there for a story. Not yet. It was just habit, she told herself. She liked watching the way Ruth arranged silence. The door creaked open again at precisely 7:10. Mr. Connolly, former postmaster, stepped in holding a bag of cranberries wrapped in twine. He nodded without speaking, and Ruth smiled without asking. She took the bag, placed it in a wooden bowl beside the register, and handed him a small bouquet of lilies and marigold. Sempasukel. His wife had loved those. As the old man left, the wind brought in someone else, Sergeant Clyde Rourke, flanked by Deputy Sloan. Rourke's boots left tiny imprints of moisture on the floor. His smile showed just enough teeth to be called polite. "Morning, Miss Delaney," he said, scanning the store as though it were a warehouse in dispute. Ruth nodded. "It's a cold one." Rourke leaned an elbow on the counter, his other hand resting casually near the day-old carnations. "Cold's not the only thing creeping into this town lately. Heard some folks say your shop don't have a security system." "I have sunlight," Ruth said simply, trimming a leaf with one snip. Rourke laughed. Not loud, but sharp. "See, that's what makes you charming. But charming don't pay for protection, Ruth. Not these days." Sloan said nothing. His eyes flicked between Ruth's face and a spot on the wall just behind her. A photo of the shop in 1989, opening day. Ruth put down the scissors. "The only protection I need is sunlight." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy. Rourke stood up straight, brushing imaginary dust from his shoulder. "Suit yourself," he said. "Hope the flowers are as durable as you think." That night, someone shattered the window. The street lamp flickered as red spray paint curled across the glass like a vine. "Shut it down." The neighbors didn't say much. A few glanced at the damage, mumbled things about kids, mischief, no respect anymore. Ruth arrived before dawn, gloves already on, broom in hand. She swept glass into slow spirals, pausing only to set a fallen pot upright. A single carnation, stem cracked, had spilled onto the step. She knelt and dug a finger into the dirt. Gently, carefully, she pressed the flower back in. Miriam watched from the cafe, fingers tightening around her cup. Ruth's hands didn't tremble. By mid-morning, Rourke returned, this time holding a folded paper in one hand and a smug shrug in the other. "Health inspection," he announced. "Sorry, Ruth, it's protocol." Sloan followed him inside, clipboard pressed tight to his chest. Ruth didn't argue. She stepped aside, brushing a petal from her sweater. They searched for 20 minutes. Ruth stood behind the counter, calm. She didn't frown. She didn't pace. Then Sloan straightened, holding up a small plastic bottle. "No label," he said, avoiding her eyes. "Tucked behind the fertilizer." Rourke's grin widened. "That'll be a violation. Enough to close the place until it's reviewed, unless we take her in first." Miriam dropped her phone, trying to take a photo from across the street. Ruth allowed them to cuff her without a word. Her wrists, fragile but firm, were guided behind her back. She turned, not to Rourke, but to Sloane. "You should be careful with the soil you stand on. It remembers who steps wrong." They thought putting her in a cell would make her disappear. But some roots grow deeper when buried. The bench was colder than it looked. Ruth sat with her back straight, hands resting gently on her lap, as if she were waiting for a bus rather than sitting inside a holding cell. The buzz of the overhead fluorescents droned on, mixing with the occasional hiss of the old radiator in the hallway. No one had spoken to her since they logged her in. She hadn't touched the sandwich left on the tray beside her. It was soggy at the edges now, the plastic wrap half peeled. Her coat had been returned, wrinkled but intact. Inside one of its hidden pockets, her fingers worked slowly, folding a page torn from the wall calendar above the toilet. It was soft at the edges and bore a faint image of a puppy in a field, now creased into sharp angles. Bit by bit, she turned it into a crude flower, 4 petals and a center that didn't quite hold. She placed it beside the tray like a signature. Outside the cell, Deputy Sloane walked past twice without stopping. On the third pass, he paused, glanced inside. Ruth didn't look at him, but she knew he was there. She had always known how to feel presence without eye contact. Upstairs, behind a second-hand desk crammed into a laundry-scented apartment, Miriam Lee hovered over her laptop. The screen showed her blog, Quiet Watcher. The last post was dated 17 months ago. She clicked New Draft and typed without thinking. She was just selling flowers. Then, stopped. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, the cursor blinking like a silent dare. She minimized the window and opened a folder named Never Published. Dozens of files, some only half-written, scrolled by. She clicked on one from 2 years ago. Girl detained for standing still. The first paragraph made her stomach tighten. She closed it. Back at the station, Sloane was sitting at the evidence terminal. The system was old, requiring 3 passwords and a flick on the side to stabilize the screen. He watched the footage from the shop, the official record. Everything looked clean, except he rewound. Pause, frame forward, again. The timestamp jumped oddly between 6:41 and 6:43. A gap. He clicked to still, printed it. The image showed the shelf where the bottle had been discovered, before Sloane ever reached it. He folded the printout twice and slid it into the inside of his boot. In the cell, Ruth leaned back slightly and whispered something under her breath. The guard on duty didn't hear it. She didn't need him to. She pressed the call button. "You get 1 call," the officer grunted. "I only need 1. The phone was old, the cord curled like a sleeping snake. She dialed slowly, deliberately. When the line picked up, Ruth said nothing for a breath. Then, "Ariana." It started. No hello, no explanation. Just that. Sloane walked past again. This time, she called out, not loudly, just enough to stop him. "Deputy." He turned, his expression wary. She stood and approached the bars, the folded paper flower still in her hand. She passed it through the gap. Sloane hesitated before taking it. Inside, unfolded, it read, "You'll need this when your uniform no longer fits." He didn't ask what it meant. He simply folded it again, slower this time, and slipped it into his shirt pocket. That afternoon, Miriam sat cross-legged on her floor, scanning through low-resolution security footage that had been leaked to her inbox from an unnamed address. She didn't know who had sent it. The clip was jerky and looped oddly, but she watched it 5 times. The angle was high, maybe from a traffic cam or a nearby rooftop, and the sound was muted. But it showed something strange. A shadow moving into the shop moments before Sloane entered, not after. She jotted down the timestamp and opened her old blog again. She never hit publish, not yet. Instead, she checked her junk folder. There was a new message, no subject line. The sender's name was a string of numbers and dashes. Inside, a single line. "Watch the West Alley camera, 6:42 p.m., frame 184. They called her just a florist." But in another file, under lock and clearance, her last name meant something else. The light inside the warehouse wasn't fluorescent. It was filtered, low, golden, and deliberate. Ariana Delaney sat behind a stainless steel desk, 2 monitors before her, both muted, both showing the same quiet room in Maplewick's small-town police station. Ruth, in profile, didn't move except to occasionally tear a dry daisy petal by petal and whisper something inaudible with each one. Ariana didn't flinch. Behind her, a wall of server racks hummed in low frequency. She pressed her thumb against a biometric pad. A small terminal opened, revealing a secure comms line. She tapped a sequence. No names, no voice. Just a string of military code with embedded geolocation tags. The message sent itself. Far north, in Maplewick, the cafe across from the station remained mostly empty. Miriam nursed her third cup of coffee. Her inbox was open on her screen, a dozen anonymous tips unread. She ignored them. Instead, she focused on the padded manila envelope in her bag. She had found it wedged between her mailbox and the one beside it. No stamp, no return address. Inside, a USB drive and a folded scrap of paper. The file had no name, just a date, November 14th. She inserted it. The audio clicked on. Rourke's voice, unmistakable. "It'd be easier if you cooperated like Ruth didn't." Another voice, trembling, male, replied, "I'm not getting involved." "You already are," Rourke said, the smile almost audible. "Better to be helpful now than regretful later." Miriam sat still. Then she copied the file onto her desktop and named it Root Pressure. Elsewhere in the town's only high school, a student named Jamila finished printing a blog post from Quiet Watcher. She wasn't old enough to vote, but she knew when something was unfair. The title on the top of the page read, "They Took the Wrong Flower." She folded it into quarters and slid it into the sleeve of her notebook. At the police station, Sloan sat stiffly at his desk, scrolling through internal bulletins. Most were standard. Maintenance alerts, low supply forms. Then, one caught his eye. Subject, containment strategy for narrative fallout. The memo referred vaguely to mitigating optics, community containment, and retaining leverage via selective enforcement. There was no author. Sloan printed it. Again he folded it. Again he hid it, this time behind the lining of his locker. Downstairs, Officer Paley entered Ruth's cell quietly. She offered her a small paper cup. "Tea," she said. "Someone thought you might want something warm." Ruth looked at her, then at the cup, then back. She accepted it with both hands, sipped once. Her eyes found Sloane's. They didn't accuse. They didn't plead. But they held him still, like frost on a windshield, clear only if you didn't blink. In Atlanta, Ariana minimized the surveillance feed. She opened a second window, this one showing heat signatures. Two figures stood motionless inside the sheriff's office, Rourke and someone else. She watched for 10 full seconds, then closed the file. Outside the station, murmurs started to rise. Miriam's latest post had gone live. She grew a storm in silence. Within minutes, comments surged. A regional activist group reposted it. Then a veterans forum. Then a small local news account. Phone lines in Maplewick began to ring. Reporters asked for statements. Residents started stopping each other in grocery aisles. At the front desk, the receptionist fielded calls in clipped tones. "I'm not authorized to comment." "I'll take your number." "I'm just the receptionist." At Rourke's office, a knock came softly. He opened the door. A plain brown envelope had been left on the floor. No return address. He picked it up, sat at his desk, and opened it. Inside was a single photo. Faded military issue. A young woman stood at attention. Crisp uniform, no smile. The name tag read, A. Delaney. When Delta Force moves, it doesn't make noise. It leaves silence behind. Inside the dim-lit warehouse bunker, Ariana Delaney moved with clinical precision. Her presence was never theatrical. She didn't need raised voices or dramatic gestures. She logged one final code, eyes flicking to a wall of monitors, where time codes blinked in the dark. The confirmation came in a faint tone only she could hear, a low pulse of affirmation. She didn't smile. Instead, she leaned back, arms crossed, and stared at the live feed from Maplewick. The station's exterior sat bathed in pale orange from the street lamp. A single figure stood outside, placing a candle gently on the concrete ledge beneath the barred window. Inside that cell, Ruth Delaney sat motionless. A notebook rested on her knee, half full now. Each name written in it was penned with a kind of reverence, each letter deliberate. She didn't bother asking for updates. She knew when the weather shifted, not in the air, but in people. The candles multiplied. First 2, then 5, then a dozen. Some were tea lights. Others were lopsided votives in glass jars. A child brought one in a painted soup can. No one spoke. They just left them there, one after another. At the same time, in Miriam's cramped upstairs apartment, the radiator hissed behind her as she opened a second envelope. The seal had already been broken. Inside, a stack of invoices stamped confidential and police operating discretionary funds. Some were for street security consulting. Some were blank line items with dates and initials that matched names she'd only seen whispered in previous leaks. Her pulse slowed, not sped. This wasn't panic. It was purpose. She began scanning each page, marking them with a thin yellow highlighter. Every 10th word she circled. A pattern emerged. Across town, Sloane stood in the hallway of the station, watching Rourke through the glass window of the captain's office. The man was pacing, hand clenched around a half-empty tumbler. The blinds were mostly closed, but they shivered with each step he took. When the phone rang, Rourke didn't answer on the first ring, or the second. On the third, he grabbed it and barked, "We're handling it." His voice cracked halfway through, handling. Sloane couldn't hear the other side of the call, but he watched Rourke's shoulders stiffen. A tremor passed through the glass of the tumbler as he set it down. Carefully, as if afraid it would shatter. Then he pointed, fast and sharp, signaling Sloane into the room. "You want to tell me," Rourke growled, "why people are outside with candles like we're running a goddamn funeral?" Sloane didn't answer. The silence pressed in, harder than words. Back at her screen, Miriam hit upload. The blog post, "She Grew a Storm in Silence," went live at 2:14 a.m. She barely breathed as she clicked the final button. 17 minutes later, it was reposted by a small regional outlet. 2 hours after that, it landed on a national site. The headline read, "Florist or Firestarter." The comments came fast, faster than she'd expected. "They arrested a grandmother? This smells like small-town power games. Someone tell the cops who her daughter is." Miriam leaned back, letting the screen glow against her face. In the warehouse, Ariana saw the same headline pop up on one of her mirrored feeds. She didn't click it. She didn't need to. She'd known it would happen. This precise cascade. In the station, Ruth's cell door creaked open. The young officer, Haley, the quiet one, stepped in, holding something wrapped in clear plastic. A coat, freshly pressed. Ruth stood, took it, ran her fingers down the sleeve until she found the stitch, the one they hadn't matched quite right. She traced the line, then smiled. They tried to erase it. They never learned that scars speak. You can cut every stem, but the soil still remembers where the roots were. The station doors opened just after sunrise. No formal apology. No press. No officer walked beside her. Ruth Delaney stepped out alone, her coat buttoned, her breath visible in the chilled air of Thanksgiving morning. She paused at the top of the steps, then began walking, slow and steady, down Main Street. Not a single word passed her lips. Maplewick was quieter than usual. The bakery didn't open. The shoe repair shop stayed shuttered. Even the church bells skipped their morning ring. People had seen the candles outside the station. They'd read the blog post. Some had watched the viral clip that now floated on social media with captions like, "This is not justice," and "She Grows Storms." On the iron gate outside Petals and Roots, a single red rose had been tucked into the latch, its stem curved like a question mark. Ruth paused and touched it lightly before opening the gate. Inside, shards of glass still glimmered in the corners where the broom hadn't reached. The register light blinked softly. Someone had plugged it back in. She didn't sweep. Not yet. She stood in the middle of the shop, breathing in the layered scent of soil and eucalyptus, as if reacquainting herself with something that had waited patiently. Down the street, Miriam stood beneath the overhang of the closed bookstore. Her camera hung around her neck, but she didn't lift it. Not yet. She watched instead. watched as a silver sedan pulled up, and an older woman stepped out carrying a cracked teapot wrapped in cloth. It was Mrs. Carroll. She shuffled to the shop's doorstep and placed the teapot carefully by the door. Inside it, a messy bouquet of wildflowers poked out, some fresh, some dried. She didn't knock, just stepped back and walked away. Mr. Ben arrived next, holding a small bag of seeds. He didn't even glance at the windows, just left them on the stoop and went. Two teenagers, one with chipped nail polish, the other with a skateboard under his arm, approached slowly. They had nothing in their hands. But they sat on the steps, backs against the railing, and stayed. At the police station, Sloan stood at his desk, staring at the empty mug that used to bear the department seal. He picked it up, turned it in his hands, then set it back down. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket and placed it under the mug. Then he removed his badge. The note said, "I didn't stop them, but I won't stay blind." He left without speaking to anyone. By noon, the town square, usually buzzing with the Thanksgiving parade, was still. The parade had been postponed due to safety concerns, but people gathered anyway. Not in costume, not with floats, just in coats and scarves and silence. They stood with hands in their pockets, heads tilted forward. Some held candles. Others held signs with no slogans, just flowers drawn in pen, or a single blue carnation pressed to paper. At Ruth's shop, the lights inside had turned warm. Miriam returned home briefly, her inbox bursting. Veterans, nurses, former journalists, strangers. One message read, "My mother was arrested in, quote, 68 for standing still too long. Thank you for not letting it happen in the dark this time." Another simply said, "She reminds me of someone I wish I had defended." Back on the street, a black SUV rolled to a slow stop outside the flower shop. No one got out. Ruth, behind the window, didn't move. She watched it, eyes level, shoulders square. It didn't matter who was inside. Not anymore. That night, Miriam uploaded a single image. Ruth stood in silhouette, framed by candlelight behind the glass, holding a single blue carnation near her heart. The caption read, "She never asked for justice, but now it stands with her." She never said her daughter wore a uniform. She never had to. 1 week after Thanksgiving, in a narrow room buried 3 floors below the Capitol, a defense subcommittee hearing moved forward without cameras. Only 5 people sat at the long table. One of them was Ruth Delaney. She didn't wear her uniform. She didn't need it. When they asked for comment, she didn't offer details. She didn't speak of leaked documents or back-channel authorizations. She didn't name the officers, or even the town. She simply said, "When law becomes threat, duty must become protection." No one asked her to elaborate. In Maplewick, the flower shop opened early. Ruth turned the latch with the same hand that had once swept glass off those floors. The bell above the door rang softly, once. She moved behind the counter and straightened a small display of blue carnations, their edges still wet from the morning mist. She wiped the register screen, smoothed the edge of a ribbon, as if nothing had changed. A girl, maybe 8 years old, came in just before 8. She had a paper envelope folded in half and a $5 bill tucked into it. She walked straight to the counter, eyes wide, and pointed at a small bundle of violets. "For my grandma," she said. Ruth wrapped them gently, added a sprig of mint, and handed them over. The girl didn't smile, but her fingers curled around the paper with a kind of reverence before she left. At the top of the hill, Miriam sat in her podcast studio, really just a refitted closet above the bookstore. The mic buzzed faintly as she clicked record. "This is Quiet Bloom," she said, "and today we don't tell a story. We remember one." She read a letter submitted by a student named Jamila. "We had a parade without noise. We walked behind candles, and I think she led us. She didn't march. She just stood where they told her not to. And it felt like she gave the rest of us permission to stop pretending we couldn't see." Miriam didn't speak for a long moment after reading it. The silence filled more than the space between words. It filled the space between people. The mayor's office never issued a statement. Sloan was last seen boarding a Greyhound headed west. No badge, no bag, just a small envelope in his coat pocket. That afternoon, a courier arrived at Petals and Roots. Ruth accepted the package with a nod. No signature required. Inside was a photograph. Ariana standing beside the Secretary of Defense, head turned slightly, one hand mid-salute. On her lapel, a new pin, a silver flower with 4 pointed petals. No message, just the image. Ruth studied it, then folded the photo along its crease and walked to the back shelf. There sat the old, cracked teapot, still holding dried wildflowers from Mrs. Carroll's visit. Ruth placed the medal inside, beside them. Then she filled the kettle. As steam began to rise, she poured a single cup of tea, the curls of vapor catching the soft winter light spilling through the front windows. She didn't say a word. The shop bell rang once, and then, quiet. The steam from Ruth's teacup curled upward, catching the morning light like a secret finally allowed to breathe. She didn't speak of what had been lost or what had been exposed, only tended the quiet that now surrounded her, as if trust had begun to take root where silence once stood guard. Justice, in the end, didn't arrive with shouting or retribution. It crept in through open doors, steady footsteps, and the decision to no longer look away. Because sometimes, power isn't reclaimed by raising your voice, but by never lowering your gaze. If this story reminded you of someone who stood their ground in silence, consider sharing it with those who still wait to be heard.